I am here to discuss the so-called flying saucers.
I knew that I had never seen anything like that before. It was not anything from this earth that I'm quite sure of.
And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us?
We are all familiar with the term UFO, with alien spacecraft and extraterrestrial invasion. But it was the term Foo Fighter that emerged at the end of World War II as its forerunner. Those unexplained bright lights, highly illuminated spheres or discs, playing at the wingtips of the 415th Night Ops Squadron, causing considerable concern whether or not they were Nazi secret weapons or alien invasion. The following flood of sightings in the sky was crystallised into the now everyday and simply descriptive phrase coined by the United States Air Force, unidentified flying object. But with many tens of thousands of sightings over the 75 years since the first Foo Fighter reference, there is simply no tangible evidence, at least in the public domain, that any of them are of extraterrestrial origin. There is a tangle of conspiracy theories about cover-ups, suspicion of authorities at the highest level, but no evidence that we can touch today. But we do have some incredible stories which capture the imagination.
I know what happened is true, there's no doubt, period. There's no delusion.
Certain secretive units that belong to certain governments that are very preoccupied with UFOs visiting Earth.
In the late 70s in Brazil, there were a raft of UFO sightings, and these were documented intricately by both the Brazilian and the US government. They were seen to follow residents around, and they would hit them with a light which would cause radiation-like injuries as well as paralysis, and in 4 cases, death.
Do we know enough to decide? Are any of these UFOs simply controlled by intelligence from an alien force? There is little doubt that a proportion of the UFO sightings that have been recorded can be taken account of by known science and technology. They could be down to some sort of scientific phenomenon, some combination of physics and chemistry leading to an effect that we simply can't understand and leaving us confused. They could be down to covert aircraft development, secret weapons activity by any of the superpowers over the intervening 75 years since the end of World War II. Obviously kept away from the public prying eyes, but occasionally leaking out and providing a sneak preview for the public, which could be quite disturbing. Of course, it could be simply down to the brain itself. We have a good understanding of how the brain works and how easy it is to confuse it, leading it to the wrong conclusions. Or it could be down to mind games at a national level, one nation upon another, fueling uncertainty, lack of trust and unrest. What we need to do is to review the facts, see what sits beneath each of those options, and then you decide. What do you believe?
I got to look inside and it had really small chairs, and I think that was the first confirmation I had. That was just a shocking thing, because every time before that I was able to label it, well, this is just a little advance that a group of scientists had formed, and they're keeping it secret, and yeah, we could have built a big disc like that, that's no problem, and we could have adapted these to make it fly, but why does it have little furniture inside, essentially little seats, and things began to click together just all too fast.
As an aviation historian, enthusiast, I've had a passion for aircraft since childhood, an aircraft spotter. As an ATC cadet, I studied aircraft, And we had an aircraft recognition team, which I was pleased to lead, and we became actually amongst the world's top 10 aircraft recognition teams. Back one day in 1963, I'm watching a Canberra coming over, contrailing. I've got the binoculars on it, and then into vision come 3 discs. Now I know aircraft, and these I could not identify. They were unidentified. But what puzzled me is the fact that they manoeuvred. As the Canberra came heading out from west to east at around 30,000 feet, these things were zipping backwards and forwards, seemingly over it, but performing very fast.
Any military power with the ability to fund it is constantly looking for a source of competitive advantage in terms of combat, looking to push the limits in terms of stealth, speed, agility, and destructive capability. Technology is developing at a breathtaking, exponential rate. Just look at the developments that have taken place since the very first powered flight in 1903 by the Wright brothers, taking us through developments in World War I, World War II, pushing out into space in the early 1960s, putting a man on the moon in 1969, then more recently with the Perseverance mission to Mars, actually placing the rover unit down onto the red planet and feeding back information and photographs.
Skycam maneuver has started. About 20 meters off the surface.
We're getting signals from MRO.
Tango Delta.
Touchdown confirmed. Perseverance safely on the surface of Mars, ready to begin seeking the signs of past life.
We've mastered the technology to safely place a vehicle of our own on another planet. Why then do we find it so surprising, so beyond belief that an alien race could be doing exactly the same on Earth, sending probes here to search for signs of what they perceive to be life? What if we were modern Martians? What would we think if a probe descended from the sky? Would we even notice? We know that the end of World War II effectively closed down the secret weapon development program for the German Third Reich, but the following Cold War effectively launched the US secret aircraft development program in Area 51 with the U-2 high-altitude spy plane.
There's a lot going on in the region, and the U-2 provides an integral piece of the intelligence gathering for the nation. We do that by flying very high with the most modern sensors in the world to be our nation's eyes and ears, if you will. Without the U-2, if it weren't around and flying these missions, it'd be like fighting the wars with one of our eyes closed and maybe one of our ears plugged.
What then followed was a series of dramatically innovative, highly secretive aircraft development in a development pipeline that must surely be ongoing even today.
Colonel Slater is a real Cold War hero who I write about. He was the commander of the base for a number of years in the 60s, and he explained to me how often commercial airline pilots would be flying on the West Coast, let's say at dusk, at 30,000 feet, and they would see the ox cart fly overhead at 90,000 feet at Mach 3, and people in the plane would see it as well, and the pilots would radio in, UFO, UFO, and Colonel Slater would have to send the FBI to wherever it was the plane was landing and make the pilots and the people sign inadvertent disclosure forms, letting them know they'd be in real serious trouble if they told anyone about that. And these kind of things certainly only added to the UFO lore and mythology.
You always have a puzzle when you see something that's an unidentified flying object. Now, I knew aircraft. Now, the existence of some aircraft was not being admitted. Whether you'd picked up an aircraft that was not yet in the recognition books, I don't think so, because it clearly wasn't an aircraft that I would have said that had anything to do with what either the West was creating or the Russians were creating. They were just simply perplexing.
Perhaps it shouldn't surprise us that from time to time we see objects in the sky that we simply don't understand, using technologies that we haven't seen before, because they haven't been exposed and explained to us for very good reasons of secrecy. Stealth has been a long-term concern of the United States Air Force, starting in the early 1950s with the development of the U-2 flying at altitudes in excess of 70,000 feet, when other military aircraft were limited to 40,000 feet. This was then superseded in the 1960s by the A-12 with a design that was focused even harder on reducing that radar detection footprint.
Ken Collins, one of the CIA pilots, he said the first time they showed it to me, he said it was the prettiest airplane I'd ever seen in my life. And he said the first thing I thought was, it's a spaceship. Another reason for painting the plane black, there are actually about 4 different reasons. One is the sky is so dark up at 85 or 90,000 feet that a silver airplane stands out like a sore thumb. The original U-2s were basic aluminum and they stood out like a sore thumb. They looked like UFOs, so they painted them darker colors.
It pushed hard on the boundaries of material science, introducing a whole new branch of metallurgy around titanium-related technology, and introduced a new series of radar-absorbing composites. Where the U-2 had a top speed of 500 miles an hour, the A-12 had a top speed of over Mach 3 at 2,300 miles an hour and could reach altitudes of 85,000 feet. Just when the enemy was getting used to catching glimpses of flashing lights and unidentified objects at high altitude, the ceiling was pushed some 20% higher. The A-12 was ultimately deposed by the legendary and long-serving SR-71 Blackbird. It was capable of flying at similar altitudes and speeds to the A-12, but with a much longer range and a much higher load-bearing capability, carrying more fuel and heavier cameras to assist those surveillance operations. The ultimate aim was to take that stealth capability that was continually being developed and combine it with destructive bombing capability, which then takes us to the United States Aurora program, which has been rumoured to be ongoing since the mid-1980s. There have been telltale signs, mysterious sonic booms heard up in the skies, strange vapour trails. To the casual observer, there are things happening up there in the sky that we simply cannot identify and we do not understand, perceived as UFOs when they might just simply be glimpses of those covert operations still under development.
The first time you see it from a head-on view, it kind of looks ungainly. It's all faceted angles and not a lot of curves to it. So you're kind of looking at it thinking, is this really going to fly?
I read in the newspaper in the Los Angeles Times a very short paragraph that said a pilot had been injured in the desert. His name was William Park, and there was no details in that little thing, that little clip. And I always remember reading that and realizing or thinking that's very unusual. There's something going on up in the desert that they're not telling anything about, but they had to say something about the accident. This was secret, special access required, which is a couple of levels above secret to be able to access the program. So the secrecy, the classification of the program was at the same level as the Manhattan Project. As you know, it's a very unusual looking airplane and it's very highly swept angles. And my first thought was the darn thing must be a re-entry vehicle. The first prototype was on the floor. What was available was the wooden mock-up. They had a complete wooden mock-up, full-scale wooden mock-up they were using to do the wire runs in. This is really crude, manufacturing process. I can say this, the Air Force were flying A-7s as a cover airplane, supposedly working on some advanced system, and they were kind of secret. They used the A-7 as their cover story. Our cover story was just simply we just didn't talk about it.
This secret weapon pipeline is constantly pushing the limits of what we previously had thought was achievable. Even now, new science and new technology is set to introduce the world to what for this era must surely be the ultimate fighting and flying machine. Still under development, but capable of flying at speeds of in excess of Mach 6, 5,000 miles an hour. Advanced propulsion systems have long been a focus for covert developments, and this new craft is likely to involve everything that we know. Conventional turbojet compression will take it to speeds in excess of Mach 2. Ramjet technology will then swing in and take over, using aerodynamic compression and subsonic combustion combined with afterburners to take it to the range of scramjet technology, with supersonic combustion to reach the staggering speed in excess of Mach 6. In flight, such an aircraft will look unlike anything we have ever seen before. We had better get ready for a whole flood of sightings of unidentified flying objects. When it comes to agility, there are no shortage of sightings of unidentified flying objects up in the skies that demonstrate maneuverability the like of which we've never seen before. But are these really evidence of alien spacecraft? Potentially. Or are we simply seeing evidence of covert experimentation in agility as part of aircraft development programs that have been running for decades? 3D thrust vectoring has been a major focus to provide such agility, using directional engine thrust to develop the maneuverability rather than the airflows around the aircraft and the associated aerodynamics. The United States have been experimenting with a multi-axis no-tail aircraft, or MANTA for short, providing yet another extraordinarily shaped craft, displaying agility, speed and stealth up there in the skies, even during the development phase. It must surely be naive of us to believe that we are aware of 100% of the covert developments that are being undertaken by the United States Air Force. Undoubtedly there will be new craft in development that we know nothing about, that have been successfully kept away from the public gaze. And of course we have to assume that other superpowers, Russia, China, will surely be following their own secret weapon development agendas.
In the early 90s, at the fall of the USSR, they had a policy of glasnost and perestroika, openness and rebuilding. In terms of openness, they haven't quite got to the stage of freedom of information like the UK and the USA have. But in terms of rebuilding, their technology could have come on leaps and bounds from what we know of in the past. A lot of the things that we see in the skies could be Russian or even Chinese technology.
There are undoubtedly new craft entering the skies on a regular basis. Objects up there in the sky that only a tiny few across the world know anything about. And for everyone else, we struggle to identify. A significant proportion of the sightings of UFOs are represented by physical objects up in the skies. But what are those ultra-agile lights seen playing at the wingtips of the 415th Night Ops Squadron, which takes us right back to Foo Fighter sightings? A proportion of those will undoubtedly be accounted for by reflections of the sun caught at lower altitude from high-altitude spy planes. Commercial aircraft cabin crew flying at no more than 20,000 feet will undoubtedly have caught glimpses of these flashes of light and reported them as unidentified flying objects.
Out at Area 51, the U-2 spy plane accounted for over 50% of all UFO sightings on the West Coast. It flew at 70,000 feet, which is about 13 miles up. And when it was flying up in the sky, it looked like a giant silver cross. And you can imagine people on the ground seeing something up that high would wonder. And then, of course, the same thing happened in the 1960s when this incredible CIA spy plane called the Oxcart was flying at Mach 3, even higher up.
You're speechless when it happens. You don't experience anything except what's going in your eyes. I was just staring. I was in awe. If I was the only one that seen it, I probably wouldn't even talk about it. Be like a UFO.
Ball lightning is another potential source of bright lights, globes, disks travelling through the atmosphere. Although there's still some debate amongst the scientific community as to whether or not ball lightning is real or imagined, whether it's a true physical form or whether it's simply an optical illusion. However, there were a group of Chinese researchers in 2012 that observed a 5-meter diameter ball of lightning that existed for a couple of seconds and travelled over a number of meters. The theory they've generated for this is that it resulted from a conventional lightning strike on the ground that generated a plume of high-energy, ionized soil particles which then coalesced, and as they coalesced, they emitted an eerie light.
People have speculated that some UFOs could be ball lightning. The problem with that is ball lightning only lasts a few seconds at a time, so it doesn't really account for a lot of these huge lights which are sometimes seen for hours.
Perhaps less exotic and more familiar than ball lightning is the well-known electrical discharge in air. As in a storm, this results from high levels of turbulent, energetic airflows within the atmosphere, generating ionized gases and strong electrical fields, which then discharge, creating lightning, often linked or seemingly attached to sharp points or edges of electrically conducting materials, possibly even wingtips. Related to this, we have what is known as St. Elmo's fire, which is a more long-lasting corona discharge between highly charged particles in the air, generating a glowing plasma, more akin to the discharge of a neon light tube than a spark discharge in lightning. The colour is invariably bright blue or violet and is quite familiar to cabin crews across cockpit windows. Occasionally, but very rarely, St. Elmo's fire has been associated with the wingtips of planes, seemingly following the structure or even playing at those wingtips. There's another explanation of UFOs that draws upon science that takes account of both their physical nature and potentially the association of lights, and it's been developed by the community of UFO researchers.
A lot of UFO sightings seem to have a link to nuclear phenomena. So when you're trying to manage the nuclear reaction process, the geometry and the materials that you use are really important. So if you were trying to create a small nuclear reactor, it would have to be a sphere or a tic-tac or an upside-down bell shape, and these are the shapes that you tend to see reported as UFOs. So that begs the question, is there a nuclear connection with these things that we're seeing in the sky? Could this be a propulsion system that we don't know about, either terrestrial or potentially even extraterrestrial? In terms of investigating UFOs, the US investigators were obsessed, particularly in the 50s, with testing for radiation. They knew that there was a link there somewhere, and it could be because this was something that they were developing themselves. There wasn't a lot of regulation in the 40s and 50s when they were starting to develop their nuclear program. One of the things that they admitted that they were doing was developing a system of constant altitude balloons, which they said was to carry microphones to listen to possible Russian atomic explosions. But the team that were developing these balloons were the nuclear weapons team, not a reconnaissance team. So to me, that says that perhaps what they wanted the constant altitude balloons to carry were in fact possibly small nuclear reactors.
There were 2 nuclear tests codenamed Teak and Orange, and they actually took place down in Johnston Island in the Pacific, not at Area 51, but the crew that worked regularly at Area 51 wiring nuclear bombs went down there. And the idea, the president's science advisor at the time, his name was James Killian, he had such power and persuasion with the president that anything he did not have to report to Congress. But at the time, James Killian authorized this 2-headed nuclear weapons test. These are megaton thermonuclear bombs. One was set off 28 miles up. The other was set off 50 miles up.
In terms of what you'd see if you did manage to put a small nuclear core in the sky, The metal container would glow orange and red as it heated up, and then as the reaction reached critical point, you would see a blinding white or blue glow and potentially flashes in the sky. One example where this was seen by thousands of people was Kecksburg in 1965, where a metal bell-shaped object was seen to blast over Canada and the US and land in the USA.
So could some of these sightings be explained by established science that the public are already aware of, or at least they're aware of the basic principles? Could it be the superpowers putting nuclear devices into the skies at high altitudes, just like Operation Hardtack in 1958? You decide on their credibility. But clearly these are explanations that could at least in principle account for these bright lights, these Foo Fighter-like reports of sightings across the globe.
Yes, you can get shadow and light that will deceive you, and at night particularly you can get deceptive appearances. I've been surprised at an oncoming UFO because there's no sound and bright light. I didn't know aircraft at night, I knew aircraft in the day, but these things still have me puzzled even today.
This group of soldiers, they were out guard duty at this base in Shropshire, and they saw these clusters of small rotating objects in the sky. Later emerged the manager of a nearby hotel and had a wedding party on the night of this sighting, during which the guests had released a large number of Chinese lanterns. And so the obvious conclusion was that what had been seen by these soldiers were Chinese lanterns.
The brain is a hugely complex piece of bioengineering, and over the years it has adopted and evolved some very neat methods for data processing. Each and every one of us is constantly being bombarded by a vast amount of data supplied through each and every one of our senses, which our brain then has to make sense of in real time to then determine how to react. It is a mammoth data processing task, and over the eons of evolution, our brains have devised a very neat trick for data processing, which is simply described as pattern matching. Absolutely everything we have ever experienced, everything we've ever been taught, everything we've ever known is simply stored in our brains as a pattern. It is as if inside our heads we have an enormous virtual filing cabinet. And inside that filing cabinet, beautifully filed, beautifully indexed, we have patterns for everything we have ever processed through our brains. What we are then constantly doing subconsciously is fingering our way through those filing cabinets to see if there are any patterns in there that will help us understand and make sense of whatever is happening in the moment here and now, so that we can then react in the moment. It is a hugely powerful asset, but from time to time it can lead us astray. Let's see how this works. Presented with each of these images, our brain rapidly, subconsciously undertakes a pattern search. What we then interpret is that we're looking at cloud formations that look like flying saucers hovering overhead. But we've never actually seen a real flying saucer. So why do we think that? From a very early age, current generations have been presented with language and imagery that have locked patterns of flying saucers into our filing cabinets. The vivid and exotic nature of that information makes it all the more powerful and easy to extract when prompted. Even if there isn't a perfect match with our pattern of a flying saucer, our brain can handle it. The brain doesn't like that mismatch, so effectively it simply airbrushes out any information that mismatches between reality and the pattern that's in your filing cabinet. And before you know it, it looks like you have a perfect match. You are definitely looking at flying saucers, provided you ignore all the information that is inconsistent. Let's see how our brain distorts our interpretation of the facts using this patterning system, using this example of a UFO sighting in India from 2015. What was seen was described as a huge white balloon, maybe 10 feet in diameter, moving across the mountain ridge. They initially thought it was some sort of party balloon, or maybe then a weather balloon, but it didn't seem to be moving like a balloon. It was rock steady, as if it was some form of drone.
First it looked like a balloon. At first I was convinced it was a balloon. I thought somebody was having a party. Then as soon as it came slightly closer, I was like, maybe it's not a party balloon, it looks like a weather balloon. And it started coming closer, closer right from there.
As they watched it, it started to descend and with a smooth swirl hit the ground maybe 500 feet away, although the landing point itself was obscured from view. The three observers chased off to go and see where it had landed, to see what it was that they witnessed, but when they got there, it had completely disappeared. When he got back from his expedition, he decided to go online and do some research to see if he could find evidence of any other such sightings in a similar region. And much to his surprise, he identified a press cutting from some years previously, which appeared to describe an identical sighting.
I just typed Chandatal UFO thinking that something might pop up, and comes along one crazy article on indiatoday.in written in 2012, but about an incident that happened in 2004 about a bunch of geologists and glaciologists, a 5-member team, and these guys had a huge encounter with the same thing. And why I say the same thing is because they actually took a picture of it. When I saw the picture, I was like, damn, that is exactly the thing that we saw. And that's when my head flipped. So Dr. Anil Kulkarni, a senior ISRO scientist who has been mapping the glaciers for a quarter century, and his team members saw what appeared to be a robot floating a few inches above the ground, approaching the camp along the mountain slope. The oblong object between 3 to 4 feet high kept moving down the slope towards the team. It had a cylindrical head with 2 balloon-type attachments, a body, hands and 2 legs. It seemed to be walking, planting and pacing its steps like a human being.
The interesting thing to note here is how he believes he is reading an identical description of the event to that he experienced with his co-observers, when clearly the two are completely different. What he described in the first instance was a single weather balloon, maybe 10 feet in diameter, which is massively at odds with the press cutting, which describes some sort of combination of balloons walking down the hillside in some figurine-type configuration. Completely different. And yet the brain is convincing him it's identical to reinforce the story in his brain. So when we're presented with new information of any type, something we haven't experienced before, let's say glowing lights moving up in the sky with high levels of agility, we simply reach into that filing cabinet to try and find the closest pattern that will help us interpret what it is we're seeing. This clear link between pattern matching in the brain and consequential behaviour provides an opportunity for mischievous individuals to manipulate the behaviours of others for whatever reason they may have. The United Kingdom has one of the most enduring examples of this manipulation of the minds, through a photograph taken in 1934 by Robert Wilson, supposedly capturing the Loch Ness Monster in action. Closer investigation of the image clearly demonstrates that it's a hoax, and yet to this day that photograph is still used as evidence of the likelihood of the existence of a monster in the lake. And it's probably responsible directly for a sizable chunk of the economy in the Loch Ness area. This in turn leads to the potential of a more sinister mass manipulation of the brains, one nation on another, potentially using UFOs. This effect may well shed some light on one of the highest profile of all UFO sightings in the United Kingdom, the Rendlesham Forest incident. This took place in 1980 in December at a United States Air Force air base relatively close to the forest, when a routine security patrol in the early hours of the morning of the 26th of December stumbled across an alien spacecraft descending from the heavens and landing on a tripod maybe 150 feet away from the party. There are audio recordings made in the public domain of the interchange taking place between the security guards as they witness the event unfold in front of them, which gives the entire event total credibility in the public domain. However, it's also known that audio recordings were made of the conversation taking place amongst those security officers just prior to the sighting, where one of them is clearly heard to say, "Has it arrived yet?" which somewhat cast doubt on the event, because if the security patrol knew what they were about to see, how can it be an unexplained UFO landing?
Secretive units that belong to certain governments that are very preoccupied with UFOs visiting Earth for different reasons. One, maybe they're hostile. Two, maybe they're here to give us information, to teach us. Maybe, well, not maybe, for sure, the government wants this information. So there's still, believe it or not, there are those underground cloak and dagger, dark departments of intelligence services that are investigating the possibility that there is that force out there, and we want to get to it first. There's no doubt in my mind, no doubt, they're aliens, no doubt, they're UFOs.
It is curious that the vast majority of reported sightings of UFOs are concentrated in the West and predominantly in the United States of America. The Robertson panel convened in the US in 1952 to review the ever-increasing number of reports, noted how quiet the Soviets were on the topic, and suggested that they could be behind some sort of psychological warfare, all in an effort to stimulate mistrust, suspicion and unrest. Surely this is just some form of crazy conspiracy theory. But maybe not. Certainly, successive presidents ever since Truman have been put under considerable pressure to declassify secret documents, fueled by UFO researchers and a widespread public concern about activities at Area 51. Maybe this really is an effort on behalf of Russia to overturn Western democracy. Annie Jacobson, an American investigative journalist, writer for the Los Angeles Times magazine and Pulitzer Prize finalist, has pieced together some disparate pieces of the jigsaw and drawn some astounding conclusions. Post-World War II, there were two German aircraft design brothers that the United States were keen to get on side. Walter and Reimar Horton had been responsible for various Nazi secret weapon designs, including a flying disc-shaped craft. US intelligence combed Europe in pursuit of the two men, eventually finding that they'd already made links with Russia. All records after that are then classified.
There's a lot of speculation that the Nazis were developing anti-gravity tech during World War II from ancient Hindu texts. After the war, thousands of Nazi scientists disappeared to South American countries and the US, where we see most of the UFO events. Is that just a coincidence?
When I was let in, it was the first time I saw the sport model in the hangar sitting down, and I was told they could have walked me in the front door, but they purposely wanted to walk me by it. I was told not to say anything and just keep my eyes forward and walk past the disc into the office area. And I did, and as we went by it, I just kind of stuck my hands on it just to run it alongside the thing, and that was about the smallest time. After that, I got to see it actually lift off the ground and operate.
Jacobson has published a book which picks apart the various goings-on at Area 51, containing interviews with over 70 individuals that are related in some way to the Roswell incident, many of them actually working at Area 51. There are reports that a flying saucer did indeed crash in New Mexico, and that the debris was indeed taken back to Area 51, along with a number of captured aliens.
One of the most horrifying conspiracy theories that we hear of is that the reason why they needed a small, hermetically sealed coffin at Roswell is that they had actually used human beings in their nuclear weapons testing.
The claim is that the occupants actually proved to be child-sized pilots, possibly the result of a Soviet human experimentation program, with the children effectively modified to look like aliens. The craft was controlled remotely, and presumably the intention was always for it to crash and to be found. It is perhaps interesting to note that many UFO sightings are made in close proximity to United States air bases. Let's suspend judgment for a moment and just take a look at the facts. The German Horton brothers had Soviet links. Post-World War II, Joseph Mengele, the angel of death at Auschwitz concentration camp, was captured by the Americans without realizing who he was. He was then released, only to take a trip to the Soviet Union. The Cold War started shortly after World War II, around 1947, with Stalin and Truman head to head. Stalin had a real disadvantage as the Soviets were yet to develop any nuclear capability. The Roswell incident took place in 1947, a flying saucer crash site with a number of alien occupants, one of them reportedly alive. A shroud of secrecy then descended and has been maintained ever since. Could this really be the result of some Soviet misinformation strategy, occupying the minds of presidents ever since the Roswell incident in 1947? MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, has over 4,000 volunteers worldwide, generating a regular flow of sightings to grab the attention and constantly reinforcing the public's suspicion that the highest authorities simply aren't telling the truth. If there was such a strategy, it has effectively been causing unrest and running since World War II and can only be described as a success. With thousands and thousands of sightings of UFOs, there simply cannot be just one single source of those objects. A significant number must surely be explainable by individuals seeing things in the skies that they simply can't interpret. UFOs have been etched into all our brains and have become the catch-all explanation of things in the sky that we don't understand. Of course, some of these sightings could indeed be genuine evidence of extraterrestrial activity, but we need to look really carefully at even the highest profile of case studies. The Roswell incident is riddled with misinformation and conspiracies and apparent cover-up. The Rendlesham incident in the United Kingdom, what did happen to that audio file that captured the conversation of the security patrol that led up to the anticipation of an unidentified flying object arriving? And then with USS Nimitz, what happened to the recordings of the radar footage that was saved in the safe on USS Princeton? But before we jump to any conclusions, let's look at the probability of the existence of aliens. Our galaxy contains in excess of 3 billion stars. Around those stars, we have so far identified in excess of 4,000 planets, all at least potential locations for the development of life. In total, across the universe, it is estimated that there are over 2 billion galaxies. Surely life has been developed on one of those planets other than Earth. But then to visit the Earth, to want to make that journey, that life would need to be intelligent. It would need to know that life exists on Earth and to develop the technology to travel over truly vast distances, and fundamentally for them to want to make that journey. Of course, what those visiting aliens would really need is a map in order to help them find us. But that is something we've already supplied.
2, 1, we have ignition and we have liftoff. We have liftoff of the Titan Centaur carrying the first of 2 Voyager spacecraft to extend man's senses farther into the solar system than ever before. Reports coming back indicate those twin large...
Are we alone, or is there other life in the universe?
Hello from the children of planet Earth.
We believe that life arose spontaneously on the Earth, so it must be possible for life to appear on other suitable planets, of which there seem to be a large number in the galaxy.
Oiknis poteste chairete.
On the other hand, we don't seem to have been visited by aliens.
Konnichiwa, o genki desu ka?
I am discounting reports of UFOs.
I send greetings on behalf of the people of our planet. We step out of our solar system into the universe seeking only peace and friendship, to teach if we are called upon, to be taught if we are fortunate.
If we are the only intelligent beings in the galaxy, we shall make sure we survive and continue.
And it is with humility and hope that we take this step.